Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Tour Guide Academy. My name is Gökhan Köksal from Muğla Sıtkı Koçman University in Turkey, and I will be the host for today's webinar. And this is the very first of our March talks, and also it will be the very first of our English webinars, and hopefully there will be many more coming in the future. But today we have a very interesting topic, the Luwian culture in Anatolia. And I'm proud to announce our guest, Dr. Eberhard Zanger from Luwian Studies Foundation. Eberhard, welcome.
Hello, good evening.
We find this topic, the Luwians in Western Anatolia, very interesting because most of the people, especially the tour guides, are educated about the prehistory and history of Anatolia, and we are given almost a complete timeline of the of this land. But later on, when we hear about Luwians, it doesn't fit in any place or any time. That's why most of the tour guides, as well as many people, get confused about when they hear the name Luwian. So it will be very interesting for us to listen to you today. So now I'm leaving the microphone and the screen to you, and we're listening to you.
So good evening. Thank you for having me. I'm much looking forward. Love talking about the Luwians. Right now, I think I might be ready to share the screen. Love talking.
Excuse me, I think I got a break up with that. So can you repeat that, please?
I'm very much looking forward to tell you more about the Luwians and the research that has been done in the past few years. And I would like to give you an overview of the geographic and chronological framework. And I think we might already jump right into the slides. So if you are ready to share the screen.
Of course.
Okay, thank you very much.
So when you share your presentation, I will put it on our main screen.
Okay, I have to go to the presentation. Here we go.
Yes.
You see it?
Here we go. Yes.
Okay, so here we go. So this is the topic, the Luwian culture in Anatolia. And as Gökhan kindly said during the introduction, it's not part of the textbooks. And so there is a good reason to talk about what is meant by that. And my idea is, first of all, to start out with providing you with a general framework that we are looking at. So we are looking at the Eastern Mediterranean. Here you see the Anatolian Peninsula. I may call it Anatolia, I may call it Asia Minor, I may call it Turkey. I always mean basically the same thing. We are looking at the time frame of the late Bronze Age, which is 1700 to 1200 BC. So that's the time frame that is usually associated, of course, with the Hittite culture. So when you look at textbooks on archaeology, almost the entire second millennium BC in Turkey is occupied by the Hittite culture. And you can show that in maps. Here's, for instance, a map from a standard reference book that shows the extent of the Hittite civilization. During the late Bronze Age, it says 1400 to 1200 BC. And you see it covers almost the entire Anatolian Peninsula. And so there was no need for anything else. And what we at Luwian Studies are arguing that this picture is indeed correct, but it is only correct for a certain short period of time. It wasn't always like that. So you could compare that with a map of, let's say, Europe in 1941, when Germany occupied France and big parts of Central Europe. But that wasn't always like that, and you cannot say that this map of 1941 is typical of the 20th century. No, it is not. Fortunately, things did not last. And the same is true for the Hittites. They were covering a very wide area for some time, but it didn't last. And as we all know, they disappeared, and they must have disappeared for a reason. And that's something we will talk about today. But before we dive into the subject, I thought that it would make sense to say a word about myself. I'm a geoarchaeologist, so I am trained as a geologist, but specialized very early on, already during my master thesis, to work on archaeological projects as a geologist, as a natural scientist. And my earliest work was in Greece in 1982, in Iolkos, in Volos, the modern town of Volos, actually. And this is Tiryns, one of the famous citadels from the Bronze Age, the Mycenaean citadels, where I worked for my PhD in the 1980s. And so this is here a potpourri of some of the projects I did, mainly in Greece. I was then co-director on the Barbati survey with Berit Welz in the 1980s, and I was co-director on the Pilus regional archaeological project with Jack Davis in the 1990s. I worked on Crete and Thera, and then I also worked in Tunisia, in Egypt, all over the place, basically. And the last few years, I've been interested in the cosmology of the Hittite culture and worked on Yasilikaia. So this is only a short sample. This work resulted in hundreds of major newspaper articles over the years, and for one reason only, and the reason is that I found things that were new, and that was reason enough to write about it for journalists. And what I'm telling you today is the story, how I found out things that are new and are not part of the textbooks. So as I said, I was working on archaeological projects for a long time all over the Eastern Mediterranean, but never in Turkey. And in 1991, I visited Turkey to meet Manfred Kaufmann at the excavation in Troy and drive around with him to look at the plain and things like that. And after that, I also looked at some of the archaeological sites in Western Turkey. And it turned out that they're extremely rich in artifacts. This is a freshly plowed field in Chandalo, which is an archaeological site, of course, a known archaeological site used for some agriculture, as you can see. These are all Roman pottery remains, archaeologists tell me, but the site is very, very thick and tall, so you would have to excavate several meters down before you get to the Bronze Age layers. But what fascinated me is just the wealth of artifacts that we find in Western Turkey and the number of sites that there are. And this is so much more than what I was used to in Greece. And this was really an overwhelming experience. And I decided to work on this basically ever thereafter because it is so fascinating. So in 1995, I wrote a story for Aramco World, who were the sea people. And I introduced at that time, still on a completely theoretical basis, a model which looks in a very graphic format, a bit like this. If we look at the late Bronze Age civilizations that we know of around the Eastern Mediterranean in a very schematic way, you could describe them like that. You see that with the Mycenaeans in Greece and the Minoans on Crete, and there's a Cypriot culture, and then there are Hittites in central Anatolia, the Egyptians, the Libyans, and so on. And they were organized politically in different ways. It was basically a patchwork. The Egyptians and the Hittites were more centralized, But in Canaan, for instance, there were several hundred city-states at the same time or so. So you could have these petty kingdom and city-states, or you could have more centralized kingdoms. But what's remarkable about this is that there's nothing in Western Asia Minor. And despite the fact that this is the most fertile area, which is emphasized here in green, as you all know, it's the perfect climate and so much arable land, and also a lot of ore deposits, and it's in a strategically very advantageous position at the link between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, with a connection to Mesopotamia, land routes, sea routes, everything comes together there. And that it just doesn't make any sense that there was nobody living there. And so I came up with the idea to propose on a theoretical basis that there must have been something there, and suggested that to call that Luwian. Now, this is not an empire, it's just people who live there in different kinds of political organizations. But so Luwian is an abstract umbrella term to describe the petty states in Western Asia Minor during the Middle and Late Bronze Age. And why is it called Luwian? Well, for one thing, there was a language that is called Luwian, and you can see here the language distribution. Again, according to this reference book. And you see that basically Luwian was spoken in a much bigger area than Hittite. Hittite was a language that was spoken only in central Anatolia and mostly by the leading echelons of the society, by the leading class. During the 13th century, even in Hattusha, rather few people spoke Hittite. What you also see here is that people are not quite sure what was going on in Troy and south of the Sea of Marmara. It's very likely that there was a combination of different languages, like we have it in so many places. In Switzerland, we have 4 official languages. In Georgia and the Caucasus, I know that there are 50 languages. And so it was quite common that people were not united through a language. There was not just a political patchwork, it was also an ethnic and linguistic patchwork. Luwian is, of course, also a script that you very well know, the Anatolian hieroglyphs. Here in Hattusha in Chamber 2, in this wonderful inscription by Shupilulumas, which is here also in a drawing, 4 meters wide and 1.8 meters tall. And this script existed for a long time, for over 1,000 years. It's now exhibited, of course, in the Museum of Anatolian Civilizations in Ankara, and many of the finds that are there actually are from the early Iron Age and from northern Syria, like Karkemish. So from 9th century, 8th century BC, and that is where most of the finds that survived have been made so far. But if we look at the origins of the scripts, let's dive a bit more into the details here. In this diagram, you see on the left geographic regions, starting with Spain, Italy, Greece, Crete, Cyprus, Anatolia, Syria, Egypt, Mesopotamia. So we are going from west to east. And on the top screen, you see a chronological chart from 3000 BC to 700 AD, actually, AD. That's wrong up there. So, and what you see in the left lower corner, before 3000 BC, a few centuries before 3000 BC, Egypt and Mesopotamia had already a script. Probably Mesopotamia was a bit earlier because the Egyptian scripts shows influence of cuneiform, but not vice versa. And then it took 1,000 years until 2000, at least until 2000, maybe even a bit later, before the next script appeared, and that was Luwian hieroglyphic. So you see red arrows going from cuneiform and from Egyptian hieroglyphs to Luwian hieroglyphic, because there was mostly an impact by the cuneiform. So the people in Western Asia Minor, they had known these scripts that Egypt was writing, and in Babylon, people were using a script, and they basically adapted some of the principles and developed their own script that would suit their culture. And that went on for over 1,000 years. The Luwian language was actually written in 3 scripts. It is also written in cuneiform. In Hattusha, we find Luwian language written in cuneiform tablets. And then towards the early Iron Age, Luwian dialects are also written in alphabetic script. And then you also see in this picture that the Luwian hieroglyphic had an impact on the Cretan script. So pretty much almost at the same time with Luwian hieroglyphic, on Crete, a script developed, also hieroglyphic. And Fred Wauthausen, a linguist and expert with whom I've worked in the past few years, he is confident that Cretan hieroglyphic is basically derived from Luwian hieroglyphic, and so on and so forth. One thing that I emphasized here is the star at around 800 in Greece, because with this star in the textbooks, people said the Western civilization began basically with the invention of the Greek alphabet in Greece and the Homeric epics and the first Olympic Games in the 8th century BC. So, but you can tell from this picture that there was so much more going on already during the 2nd millennium BC. And so this basically Eurocentric view of the 19th century is obsolete and needs to be revised. And what I proposed at the time, even 1995 in the Aramco World article, is to look at Western Anatolia in this way. If you look at a region like Egypt, there are people who live there, the Egyptians, and there's at least one major city, but there are more. They have a certain script and they have a name that they use for themselves or that is ascribed to them by other cultures. It may be more than one name. For instance, Germany is called Germany in English, but in Germany it's called Deutschland, and in France it's called Allemagne. So, one country can have many different names. And at the time, what we had was Western Anatolia, which was a region that didn't have a culture, but we have the people who spoke Luwian, and we have cities that we know of, Troy, for instance, or Apasha, which is Ephesus today, or Milavanda, which is Miletus today, and many other cities. And we have a script, and we have a name for the political states like Arzava or Vilusha and Mira, different states. And so what I suggested is to put all that in one line, and this would then be an entire new culture, basically. And that's what we are talking about in terms of the Luwian culture. So what are the implications of that? If we look at a map, we look basically at the same map that I showed you before, only this one is derived from a different publication, but it shows here, emphasized the extent, the maximum extent of the Hittite empire, if you want to call it like that. I would call it the Hittite kingdom. It's green, the core area is in green, and lighter green are the vassal states that were connected to the royal court in Hattusha. And what happened is that this did not last at the end of the 13th century. So you see here now an area emphasized in red in Western Anatolia that is now turning red, because red is basically what I would call the Luwians, the different kingdoms in Western Anatolia. Now they are becoming politically independent, and with independence comes power, and this continues. Yeah. So the Hittite kingdom is losing vassals in the west. It's losing power, it's losing influence. And this continues down Tasha in central southern Anatolia. And up in the north, this is striped yellow and green because the border was fluctuating. But the Kashkaeans who were living there were always keeping the Hittites away from the coast of the Black Sea. And in the end, because the royal court was weak, it was entangled in internal strife, the Kashkaeans became stronger and expanded their territory. And then Assyria and Mesopotamia became stronger and stronger. And it even took the very important copper mines in Isuva and then grew even larger. So at the end, this is what the Hittite king was left with. It's basically in dark green, the core territory, plus Syria, where and somebody from the royal family was ruling, so this was a very reliable ally, and Cyprus, which was annexed rather recently, possibly, most probably, to compensate for the loss of the copper mines in eastern Anatolia, because Cyprus is, of course, very rich in copper. So if we experience this and we see how strong Western Anatolia has become, and they have been suppressed by the Hittites for some time, they had to pay taxes and they had to send them mercenaries into wars and things like that. So, and they didn't want this anymore. They may have used this weakness of the Hittite royal court to start an attack. And from what we know, and I argue in favor of that this is what happens, they did this in a very smart way, not by fighting the Hittites on land, something that they have done for many decades, again and again. They built, apparently rather secretly and over a period of a few years, they built a fleet. So they must have formed a military coalition and agreed upon some certain tactics. And this, what we then experience, is what is called the Sea People invasions. Yeah? So they went, in my opinion, in my reconstruction, as a united force from Western Asia Minor, first to Cyprus, to relieve Cyprus from Hittite rule. And the people on Cyprus may not have been entirely unhappy about that, because it was a recent thing, and then continued into Syria because that was the most reliable ally, and from there then into to the coast of South Central Asia Minor and so on. So we now have the place and country names, and we start developing a way more accurate picture of the political geography at the end of the Bronze Age, around 1200 BC, including the military actions and also including trade relations, as we will see. So, as I said, in my opinion, this is the route of the Sea People invasions. It's also the reason why there was a Sea People invasion. The Sea Peoples are basically the Luwians, the petty states in Western Asia Minor, who formed a temporary military coalition to attack the Hittite kingdom and to weaken it. And now let's look a bit at what we know about those Sea Peoples. The most famous of a few inscriptions that we have describing these events, those invasions, stems from the mortuary temple of Ramesses III in Medinet Habu in Western Thebes. This is pretty much intact still after over 3,000 years. For the simple reason that Ramesses III was the last really powerful king in Egypt, and previously 2 dozens or so other pharaohs had such a mortuary temple, but their successors used them as quarries. They used them to get building stones. But after Ramesses III, there was nobody left, basically, who was influential and powerful enough to remove this and build his own mortuary temple. And that's why we still have it today. And it has this unique feature on its northern wall where it shows in writing and in pictures what happened during the Sea People invasions. And here we see some of the captured Sea Peoples, the Tekka, with their feather crowns and bound arms. So the inscriptions say that these people united. There were different tribes. They name them. They show them in pictures. This is what they look like. You see the different types here. They have different headdresses. They had different weapons. So it was not one kind of people. It was a combination, a coalition of people who attacked the shores of the countries around the Eastern Mediterranean. They did so primarily by ship, of course, with their navies. And here you see the sea battle, 19th century illustration, etching of the sea battle. When the Egyptians are, of course, winning this war, because anything else is inconceivable. The pharaoh had to win each war, otherwise he would be punished by the gods. So there would not be a pharaoh who admits a defeat in such a big way. But these inscriptions were basically made about 20 years after the events had taken place. So Ramesses was talking about things here that were history and not really achieved by him personally. And here's some of the texts. As for the foreign countries, they made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once, the lands were on the move, scattered in war. No country could stand before their arms. Hatti, Kitsuvatna, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alasia were cut off. A camp was set up in one place in Amurru. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which has never come into being. So now the thing is, we learn a lot. We learn here about the foreign countries somewhere away, and they made a conspiracy. So they built a coalition in the islands. Now, islands. The islands is a term, it's a hieroglyphic sign that basically describes a foreign land. So it can be an island, but it doesn't have to be an island. It can be a mainland shore. All at once. So rather surprisingly, they were on the move. Nobody was expecting that. And they entered this war, and no country could stand before their arms. So they were having these attacks on all those coasts. And then he's listing Central Asia Minor, Hatti, Kitsuvatna, South Central Asia Minor, Carchemish, Syria, Arzawa, Western Asia Minor, and Cyprus, Alasia were cut off. So these were entangled. And then they set up a camp in Amurru, which is in Syria. And so this was the action. Now we have to take this with a grain of salt, because the scribes that were working for the pharaohs, they were not really supposed to write historically accurate accounts. So some of this might be true, some of this might be exaggerated. We don't really know, but something was going on for sure. Oh, by the way, this is a different source. Plato, the Greek philosopher, says, so this host, being all gathered together, once made an attempt to enslave by one single onslaught both your country, that's Greece, and ours, it should say here, Egypt, and the whole of the territory within the Straits. So this is an Egyptian priest talking to a Greek politician Solon in Egypt, and describing basically the same chain of events and providing tons of details. This is something that I worked on early on, 30 years ago. And that is not something, the parallel that I wasn't the first one to discuss that. Already in 1886. Scholars, just after Medinet Habu was first described in scientific publications, scholars who knew Plato said that these parallels are very obvious between these two accounts. So we find documents describing these events of what we now call the Sea People invasions in many different places, because it was such a momentous change, probably the biggest incision in the cultural history of mankind ever at the time. They were advancing on Egypt, this is back to the Sea People inscriptions, while the flame was prepared before them. Their league was Peliset, Teka, Chekelesh, Denyen, and Beshish, united lands. They laid their hands upon the lands to the very circuit of the earth, their hearts confident and trusting our plans will succeed. Now, clearly this is embellished, but again, we get some information. We get the names of those, and we hear that they were united and that they were attacking. Now, what does it look like from the perspective of the attackers? Here is a letter from the king of Ugarit, who's writing to the king of Cyprus, and saying, my father, did you not know that all my troops were stationed in the Hittite country and that all my ships are still stationed in Lycia and have not yet returned? So clearly there was a threat, a military threat, and the king of Ugarit in Syria was asked to provide support to the Hittite king. And so he sent his troops to the Hittite country, and he sent his ships to Lycia, which is, of course, in southwestern Turkey. So basically in the Luwian, what I would call Luwian lands. Yeah, and so he was defenseless because he didn't have any troops. The enemy ships are already here. They have set fire to my towns and have done very great damage in the country. And we know what happened to Ugarit. It was wiped out in an instance at the time when this letter was written. And it fell victim to these attacks, of course. And what does it look like from the perspective of the Hittite king? He says, I, Shopiluyuma, great king, quickly embarked upon the sea. The ships of Alashia met me in battle at sea 3 times. I eliminated them. I captured the ships and set them afire at sea. So he was victorious here, apparently, but we all know that it didn't last and that he was a last Hittite king, and that the Hittite kingdom was forgotten for over 3,000 years after that. It collapsed completely. Okay, so that is the story of the Sea Peoples from what we know from documentary evidences that have been found around the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, a few years ago, I stepped into the study of Mr. James Mellard, whom you know, of course, as the excavator of Çatalhöyük and Beşi Sultan, one of the big pioneers in Anatolian archaeology. He is sitting here at his desk, and I had an opportunity to spend 5 days in his office to look through his estate after he had passed away. And in this particular shelf, you see here the same shelf that was behind him. He was sitting at the table there below the window in the previous picture. In that very shelf, I found a kit which was clearly used to produce forgeries. And it is now proven, it has been discussed for many, many years, decades, that it is proven now that James Mellard was not only a pioneer and charismatic archaeologist, he was also a forger and producing forgeries on a very large scale in terms of documents. Amongst the documents that describe the situations at the late Bronze Age and were forged were also drawings of a very large Luwian hieroglyphic inscription. And this is 1 sheet out of 4. And here you can already see at the beginning that it's talking about a great king. In this case, it's a great king from Western Anatolia, Kupanta Kuruntas. Mellert not only had the drawings; these were done by him. We don't know where the original is. All we have is these drawings, but they make perfect sense. But he also had a translation. This is the translation of the text, and he ascribed it to the famous Turkish archaeologist Alkım in the 1980s, because Mellert himself said he could not really read Luwian hieroglyphic. This is a very poor translation. It's not really a translation. Fred Wauthausen, who translated it, says they didn't understand the language, but they got the gist of it. And it describes precisely this kind of attack that we just talked about, but now from the Western Anatolian perspective, from who considers himself the great king, Kupanta Kuruntas, so the leader of the Luwian lands, basically. What you cannot see in this translation is that the inscription consists of different blocks, and they have changed the sequence of the blocks 4 times. You can see that one block was called block 12 to begin with, then it was 19, then it was 23, and then they cut the paper for the 4th time to rearrange the paper. So the people thought that they could read the text, but they did not know in the right sequence. Now this is all published, has been published for a few years, and we know the contents of this inscription, but we don't know whether it is accurate, whether it's another forgery. It would have been very difficult, actually impossible, to produce such elaborate inscription at the time when it was first shown in 1989 during a conference, Hittitology conference. And the person who produced the translation is Fred Wauthausen, who passed away last year in September, only aged 62 years. And Fred Wauthausen has also worked on a number of other Mediterranean scripts, including the Cypriot, so-called Cypriot Minoan script, of which we have a few seals and items like this cylinder seal, which is on exhibit in the Archaeological Museum on Cyprus in Nicosia. And he's actually had it in his hands and translated it, because he has developed a key to translate Cypriot Minoan. And it turns out that this is a dreadfully boring list of laden, or so material that was commodities that were shipped from one place to another. It's basically an Excel chart, even though it's not arranged like an Excel chart. You can arrange the information in the form of an Excel chart. And these Excel charts, spreadsheets were quite common, actually. We find them 2600 BC in Egypt. The construction of the pyramids was probably only possible because the contingents of the people, the ships, the commodities that were transported, so were managed in a modern fashion with these kind of spreadsheets, basically. And they've been found on papyrus recently. And so this is how society was organized, in particular when you wanted to collect taxes, because you had to know how much people were trading in order to collect your 10% taxes, so which was the Hittite business model, basically. All those vassals had to pay them, and they used the same system, tax system, wherever they were in charge. And so the interesting thing of these spreadsheets is that you can actually reconstruct what was traded and how it was traded. And this is what Fred Wauthausen did with these documents. And you see here in red, with red arrows, what he reconstructed. So there were commodities coming from Troy, and they were supposed to go to Hattusha. and they did not use the land route. So they shipped them by sea. They shipped them to Cyprus. The archaeologists who work on Troy have found out that Troy was, during the end of the 13th century, very closely allied, connected economically to Cyprus. And here we see the evidence. So they were producing tissues, fabrics in Troy, and we know that there was a big fabric industry, sending them to Cyprus. Because Cyprus was under Hittite control, this is where they were taxed. So this is where the Hittites, using their system, but in the Cypriot language, because of course they couldn't ask the people on Cyprus to speak in a different language. They were supposed to use the Hittite taxing system, but in their language, to take account of these commodities. Then they were shipped from there to Ugarit first, and then from Ugarit to Lamia, and then from Lamia to Tarsus, and from Tarsus they went up on the land road to Hattusha. So this can be reconstructed from these seals, from these cylinder seals.
So,
excuse me. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm curious about the one thing. So, although Troy and Cyprus were had close relationships, why do you think Troy did not take the direct route to Hattusha? And don't you think this is too many change of hands for the commodities?
Once they are in Komi, once they are in Cyprus, they are under Hittite control. And so they are basically not changing hands anymore. And I was surprised when I saw that map. I was really surprised, because I thought that there are so many routes through Asia Minor, and that they were heavily used. And now it turns out they were not. There are two reasons. One is transportation by ship is 30 times easier and faster than by land. So in a couple of days or so, you're on Cyprus and you're in Hittite territory. Whereas across land, it takes much longer. It might be even more expensive, but it's certainly more dangerous. You're dealing with so many more and different people, and not all of them might be friendly or so. I think that's the main reason. It's easier and safer. But this may change our thinking of how trade was done in Anatolia, way more by sea than we have thought so far. Now, the other interesting thing is the yellow line here, because amongst those documents from Cyprus was one that is completely different. It's not a spreadsheet. This is this one. It's still in Nicosia, and the museum in Nicosia kindly sent me this beautiful photograph. And this is a letter in the same language, completely different genre of writing. And this is a letter from a nauarch, from an admiral. And this is the yellow line here. It describes the route traveled along the yellow line. So this is a Cypriot admiral, but because Cyprus is under Hittite control, he is acting on behalf of the Hittite kings, basically. So he's going to Limyra, which is a haven, a safe port that the Hittites could use. That's fine, no problem. Then he continues to go to Rhodes, and he comes to Kamairos, and he says that because this used to be a Hittite port some time ago, I claimed it for the Hittite king. Huh? So he said, well, this used to be Hittite, so it's Hittite now. Okay. Then he continues to go into the Aegean, further up north towards Samos, and suddenly he encounters a huge fleet, completely unprepared. I guess this admiral had maybe a handful of ships with him, and apparently there was even some struggle between him and this huge fleet. And these were the sea peoples. They were coming. This is the first person to encounter the sea peoples. And this is not something that was haphazardly organized or so. That must have been prepared a long time to build such a fleet and to form this coalition. So he decides that he goes back to Limira, to the safe port. In the safe port of Limira, he dictates to a scribe this letter. So here you see the admiral and the scribe writing this particular piece that is now in the museum in Nicosia. So there's more and more documents coming up describing the same story, that the sea peoples can actually be traced back primarily to Western Asia Minor. Here you see it again in a schematic format. Fred Wouthausen thinks that they had mercenaries from other places like Crete and Greece and even maybe Sicily and Sardinia, which is indicated here. They could be, but I think we both agree that the majority of the sea peoples are basically what I would call the Luwians, the Western Anatolian states, united, attacking first Cyprus, releasing it from Hittite control, then attacking Syria, and finally entering battles with the Hittite forces on land. And here you can also see how the Kashkaeans then raided Hattusha, essentially. That would have been far out of reach of the sea peoples because it's too far inland, but it's close to the Kashkaean territory. And when the Kashkaeans came there, the Hattusha was, of course, already abandoned. And so they just set fire to a few temples and things like that. But Hattusha was wiped clean, basically, by the Hittites who had left it. So with this, now we turn to the Luwians. Those, if I go back to those red circles there, those different states and people, and the question is, what do we know about these archaeologically and otherwise? Now, if you go into the field, you look at a site, this is what a typical site, archaeological site in Western Anatolia would look like. So you see fragments of stones from probably used for buildings, for foundations. You see some pottery fragments in a spot that it's not really used for agriculture because it's not fertile, but it's adjacent to a very fertile floodplain with a river. So they chose the most fertile places, and that's where they established their sites. Sometimes there are some more prominent remains, like these Cyclopean masonry walls, and this is an indication that there's so much more that can be discovered in Western Turkey from the Bronze Age. Because this is typically Bronze Age. You remember the wall from Tiryns from 1250 BC. Now, when you look at sites near the coast, the picture becomes more complex. First of all, people have lived in those tells, those huyuks, for several thousand years. So you get 15, 20 meter tall deposits, anthropogenic deposits. And on top, you get a Byzantine monastery or chapel, which cannot really be removed. So we cannot go to the Bronze Age layers. That's one thing. There are places where Bronze Age layers are excavated. But then at the coast, you get, of course, a very strong influence from other cultures like the Minoans or the Mycenaeans. And because there's so much research that has been done, so much is known about those, scholarly attention tends to go in that direction and not towards the local Anatolian cultures. So digging at sites at the coast is a bit tricky because so many different cultures have left their traces there. If we go further inland, we get the typical huyuks, like here in Baykö. That would be wonderful to excavate because it's small. It's also a bit threatened by agriculture because the farmers tend to plow closer and closer. to the tell. And this has produced at least one inscription that has also been lost, but was published before. It's a small one, but there's talk about more being found. And Bacoy is also, from my perspective as a geoarchaeologist, a very advantageous position, and could well have been the seat of one of the petty kings in the area. So that would be really worthwhile to excavate further. More tricky are the really big ones, like Medaion here, 500 meters in diameter. You see the flat top in the background with the cemetery in the foreground. Huge, and it takes a lifetime to get anything done, more than a lifetime. It hasn't even been touched. No excavations have been done there. But there are excavations on these Huyuks. And then, of course, at the top, you always get into historic deposits. It takes many, many years, if not decades, to get to the Bronze Age layers. It's tricky. That's one reason why we know so little about the Luwians, because they're buried under several meters of later deposits. Here's Shah Huyuk, another one, big one, 25 meters tall, over 400 meters wide, as here. And there, the archaeologists have already dug in the floodplain, which is a very smart thing to do, because the Bronze Age surface continues, of course, under these later alluvial deposits. And they found material there, but I think it was mostly Roman, so you would have to go even deeper. Again, very difficult because it's so big and material is moving so much along the slopes. Very difficult to tell what was really going on. One would have to basically systematically remove half of such a Huyuk in order to find the whole vertical stratigraphy. And here is, of course, Beishe Sultan, which was first excavated by James Mellard in the 1960s and is now again excavated. And here is another excavation from Seyitör Huyuk, which is a small settlement on a coal mine. Has to be removed so that the coal mine can expand. So there was a chance to really quickly reveal an entire settlement. And we learned quite a bit through these excavations, because it shows that these settlements were usually specialized on the production of one type of commodity. So that this could have been weaving, as it was in this particular case, or in Troy or so, or it could have been mining, or it could have been horse breeding or pottery production or so. So basically, craftsmen of the same kind were neighbors, and making sure that the trade is passed on and the knowledge is exchanged. And they were producing in one place, but they were not really trading in that particular place. You can use center periphery model for these settlements, because they were transporting the material to central places, often at the coast, from where they were then traded internationally. So this was a radial organization. Material was coming from the periphery towards the center and then traded from there. Maybe not that much across Anatolia, as we've seen. We've looked at these Huyuks from Google Earth and collected a few pictures, and I like to show you these because they're so beautiful. So there are plenty of them. We'll see that, almost 500. And there's so much to be done, because virtually none of them are excavated. And as long as we don't know what's sitting in these, this one is 500 meters in diameter, sitting in these anthropogenic layers, we cannot say anything about the people who lived in Western Asia Minor. So this needs to be done. Colossi Huyuk is really colossal. That's why it's called like that. It's over 500 meters in diameter. Tafchan Huyuk is a peculiar one, because in that one the habitation actually ended in 1200 BC. So there's nothing historic on top, and that's why excavations have started there this year. The archaeologists are bound to get into the late Bronze Age right at the beginning. And we'll see what comes out of it. I personally think it's another industrial town in a big scale where something was produced, and most likely in this case ore, because we find so many slags there. So we've put these all on a map. This is a geographic information system. You see Lesbos, the island, in the foreground. So we're looking from the west towards the east, towards central Anatolia. This is what the map nowadays looks like. It will be published as a little bit bigger than A3 map. So we are basically at a point where we can produce roadmaps for the late Bronze Age. And what you see on the right are excavations that have been done in these territories. They're marked with a green diamond on the map in the past 50 years. So there have been 2 or 3 dozen excavations, but the archaeologists don't see this as one culture yet. They just see one site, and then the question is, where would you put it? They were not Mycenaean, that's for sure, and they were not Hittite either, because it was too far away. At least most of the time they were not Hittite. So that's one more reason to ascribe these to a separate indigenous Anatolian culture. Now, what makes up this culture? If we look at the facts, what we know about them. As I said, we have catalogued almost 500 large settlement sites. They have to be bigger than 100 meters in diameter, and they have to be inhabited throughout the entire second millennium BC. If you compare that to the Mycenaean, Minoan, and Hittite sites that we know, it turns out we know more Luwian settlements, even without systematic excavations, than we know of the 3 others combined. If we look at the territory, the realm, let's say, of those Luwian petty states, again, it turns out that it is bigger than that of the other 3 cultures combined. If we look at the Luwian hieroglyphic script, it was found in 1812 in Syria, but it was not, of course, recognized as a Luwian script at the time. But if you compare to Linear B, for instance, or the Cretan hieroglyphic or Hittite cuneiform, it turns out that we actually knew about Luwian much earlier than we did about the other scripts. But we didn't call it Luwian. Even in the 1990s, it was still called Hittite hieroglyphs. Now, it's called either Luwian hieroglyphs or Anatolian hieroglyphs. And this script was in use for at least 1,000 years. It was abandoned during 700 BC or shortly thereafter. But if you compare that with the Mycenaean Linear B script, you see it was in use so much longer. Yeah? Even the cuneiform in Hattusha was not even half as long in use. So it was really an important script. If we look at the commodities, it turns out the Luwians probably traded mostly in fabrics, metals, maybe horses. You can see it here in comparison to the other cultures. The Hittites, as I said, the business model was basically collecting taxes, not really, they were not big manufacturers. And the Luwians never really experienced a demise. The language even continued into the Roman times. The script did not. But basically what we could call Luwian disappeared in under the Persian Empire in the 7th century BC. So, and if you ask me, researchers have systematically investigated the Luwian culture for no time at all in comparison to the other 3 cultures, which have been investigated for over 100 years and named as such. They had a name. That's important to have a name. Yeah. We know, of course, that Artsava was the most important political state in Western Anatolia during Hittite times, but we need a name to put those states on the same level with the other three cultures, and that's how I came up with this idea to call them Luwian. Now, the big question is, of course, why now? Why haven't we found out about the Luwians before? And with that, I'm turning to what one might call epistemology, or how do we know what we know? The history of knowledge. And in this particular case, how come that we know so little? What is the reason that nobody has been talking about this before? Why is it not in the textbooks? If we look at what is recorded, for instance, in the Homeric epics, the Iliad, this is the description of the political geography at the time of the Trojan War. We have a list, the catalogue of ships in the Iliad, which lists the 3 dozen or so Greek petty states that united their forces to attack Troy. They did not just attack Troy, because they destroyed a number of other sites in Western Asia Minor before they went to Troy. Troy is the last place where they gathered. And the Trojan allies are also listed, and that's put here in a very schematic way on this map. So the Trojan allies basically coincide what I would call the Luwian petty states. And so what we have, and what we call the Trojan War, is basically, from my point of view, a counterattack after the Luwians had been so successful, knocked out the Hittites. Excuse me. The Greek joined forces to attack the coastal cities of the Luwians, which were maybe not very well protected because the Luwians were all over the place. And so they had an easy time to capture those, and this is how they describe it, until both sides gather all their forces, their united forces at Troy. So we had first the Sea People invasions of the Luwians, and then a counterattack of the Greeks, which is called the Trojan War. What does the story continue? We know, of course, Troy fell, was destroyed, Troy 7a, most likely, at the end of the 12th or the beginning of the 12th century. 1182 BC, I'm saying here, something like that. If we look at the history after that, this is a long arrow. It's basically portrait picture, portrait page, the lower half of it. So here you see at the bottom, 1182 BC, the demise of Troy 7a, and then there's a time arrow up to the birth of Christ and beyond that. What's happening on the left is the Greek point of view, and what's happening on the right is the Anatolian point of view. So you see there's virtually nothing on the left except for the writing of the Homeric epics in the 8th century. But then on the right, we see a lot of admiration for the Trojans who lost the war. People who went to Troy, admired the Trojans, built temples. So all the admiration went to the Anatolian side, even though they were the losers. And if we continue, now we see the most recent bit from 520 AD to today. On the right side, you see people really went overboard with their admiration for the Trojan side, what I would call the Luwians, during the medieval period. And then we have a complete shift. And the complete shift is connected to two events. 1453, when Constantinople fell, was captured by the Ottomans. In 1683, when the Ottomans besieged Vienna for the second time. Those were really incisive moments from a European point of view to change the view we look at history. Before that, everybody wanted to be associated with Troy. After that, nobody wanted to be associated with anything that is on Ottoman territory. in fact, the Ottomans became the reason why the Europeans overcame their fragmentation and developed an ideology to be united against the Ottoman Empire. Yeah, so this is how the thinking changed. For over 2,000 years, people admired Troy, and then after these two decisive events, a new ideology was formed quite intentionally. And this ideology is then became part of the textbooks. And here's Arthur Evans, who contributed to that, the excavator of Knossos. And we see that they had an extremely Eurocentric view at the time. In particular, he was then publishing his excavations in the 1920s during the time of the war between Greece and Turkey. And of course, he was entirely on the Greek side. So if we look at the research history, Troy was found first and excavated in a big way by Heinrich Schliemann after 1870. Then Mycenae was also excavated by Schliemann, was not really discovered by him because it was always exposed after 1880. And then starting in 1900, a dozen or so excavations began on Crete. And in 1906, Hugo Winkler started excavations in Hattusha. So this is the sequence of scientific inquiry into the Bronze Age, basically. And the person who structured the knowledge that was derived from these excavations was Arthur Evans. And he defined certain cultures, which makes perfect sense, even though we should not think of them as unities. Just for our vocabulary and communications, it makes sense to give them names. And for him, the most important one was, of course, the so-called Minoan culture on Crete. And then he also recognized the Mycenaean culture on the mainland of Greece. And the obvious thing would have been to define a Trojan culture, because Troy was found first. It's by far the most prominent of all these places, and people admired it for thousands of years, but he didn't do that. Instead, he defined a Cycladic culture for the islands in the Aegean. And the reason why he did that is that this is the political boundary of Europe versus the rest. And he just wanted scholars to direct their attention only at European cultures. And he succeeded, because if Aegean, Proto and Prehistory is summarized nowadays, they would still say these are the three cultures that make up Aegean Protohistory. Of course, after the excavation in Hattusha, after thousands and thousands of documents were found and so many foundations of temples unearthed or so, there was no denying that there was another culture in central Anatolia. But the gap in between persisted. It persists even until today, and it's omnipresent in research. And I suggest that this should be filled with another culture. Now, the effect of that is, if you look here, for instance, at a standard publication on the Aegean Bronze Age, entitled The Aegean Bronze Age by Oliver Dickinson, all the Middle Bronze Age settlements are on European territory, nothing in Turkey. This was the knowledge. This is how it is summarized. Now, if you look at the early Iron Age and where the Greek scholars lived before Socrates, it turns out, yes, they lived in Greek towns or so, but they were all in Asia Minor. The knowledge that European culture is derived from originated in Asia Minor. Homer, Herodotus, all those scientists, philosophers, mathematicians, poets, astronomers, historians or so, they lived first here, and then this knowledge was transferred to Europe. Now, archaeologists tend to focus on pottery, of course, because it doesn't decay. It is very well preserved. And if we would have to name some kind of pottery to be associated with Eastern Turkey, it would probably be Anatolian redware and Anatolian greyware. But the situation is quite complicated, and there are people who've worked on this subject for 30 years. And it turns out that pottery is not really ideally suited to reconstruct political events, movements of people, trade, and so on and so forth. We are getting there to a limit. And science in general has, of course, evolved tremendously over the past 50 years, let's say, if you think of developments in medicine and biology and so on. But if we look at Aegean archaeology, if you ask me, not a whole lot has happened. 1952 was when Michael Ventris deciphered Linear B, and Michael Ventris was a layperson to begin with. And that was the last major breakthrough that I can think of. So 70 years, no big changes, even though archaeology has hired more and more scientists, like myself. Been doing this for 40 years. So natural scientists are entering archaeology in a big way. And the interesting thing is where they do that, for instance, here with the Iceman, this is 100% now in the hands of natural scientists, the investigation of Ötzi. They come up with things that are completely different from what archaeologists had thought before. The same happened here, for instance, with the pile dwellings around the Alps. We have over 1,000 pile dwellings. They're in UNESCO World Heritage now. And one excavation was only a few hundred meters from here, a car park, underground car park, where this pile dwelling from the Neolithic was unearthed. And this is almost entirely in the hands of natural scientists now, in this case, paleobotanists. We can date the finds to the year because of the dendrochronology used on the many wood items that there are. And they are toppling over these paradigms in archaeology, those scientists. Archaeologists have argued for 100 years whether the pile dwellings were built in the water, on the dry land, or in between. And this century-long discussion was put to an end by these scientists who said they were in all those three places at the same time. Yeah, and this effect of natural scientific engagement, we don't have in Aegean prehistory, even though every archaeological project now has tons of natural scientists. They do not come up with anything that questions the paradigms of Aegean prehistory, which is peculiar because those paradigms were established extremely early at a time when the people had very little information and when they basically used their gut feelings to develop paradigms. And now it's reflected in modern scholarship. So if we look at the publications on the Aegean Bronze Age shown here, these books together make up almost 3,000 pages, and not even 20 of them are dedicated to Western Asia Minor. If we look at linguistics, it's a bit different because we know quite a bit about the Luwians from documents. And my feeling is that the linguists are decades ahead of the archaeologists in this respect. And it would make perfect sense to bring the two disciplines together to develop some synergies. Because otherwise, we are stuck with this picture where we have two cultures, the Hittites and the Mycenaeans, way apart from each other. And here you see the deposition, the distribution of ore deposits, and basically all the things that would have made people rich in the late Bronze Age, but which is why it's called Bronze Age, they were in between. And people want to tell us that these were not used. Of course they were used. And now with maps like that, we get more of accurate picture of what was really going on in terms of politics, in terms of military actions, in terms of trade at the time. Now, if you want to read more about this, there are a couple of books that came out not too long ago that summarize this. I don't want to advertise this because the books are available free of charge as PDFs on academia.edu. So this is not to make money, it's just to spread information. And just one word to finish this. Gökhan Köksal kindly introduced me as representing Luwian Studies. This is a private foundation based in Zurich, established by people who want to shift the attention of the researchers towards Bronze Age Asia Minor. And we have a few principles, so to say. We want to be scientifically based, free of prejudice, away from the Eurocentric views, open access, make everything available. If you contact us, you get what you want, and try to be visually informative. And if you want to find out more about that, please visit our website or go to YouTube Luwian Studies, where there are some lectures or so, or go to my page on academia.edu, where you find all my publications. Thank you very much for paying attention.
Well, Eberhard, thank you for sharing your valuable time and knowledge with us, because this was completely enlightening for all of us. And I had tons of questions before we started this, but you answered them all beforehand, even before I asked it. And all of these informations fill up a great gap on the timeline and on the maps, and they make perfect sense. So now, if you allow me, we have a few questions from our viewers. I would like to bring them to your attention. First, let me try to show this. So we have Nazım Çokişler from Katip Çelebi University from Izmir, and he says, some of the cities mentioned on Medinet Habu and their proposed equivalents are Shardana is Sardinia, Shekelesh, Sicily, Peliset, Philistines. If this is right, how do you fit these cities into Anatolian League theory?
Yeah, thank you for that question. They are not cities, they are people. They are basically ethnic tribes that they describe, and we don't know where they came from. We don't know what these terms stand for. And you can ask different people, they come up with different solutions. And in this book, Early Mediterranean Scripts, it's a dialogue basically between Fred Wauthausen and myself. I'm interviewing him about his life work. We talk in particular about this subject, what his views are, how he would associate these ethnic names with certain geographic areas. And I'm unsure about that. I think that geographic names were used more than once in many different places or so, and it's very difficult to come up with these. I personally don't even think that it's proven that the Peliset are the Philistines. This goes back to Champollion. Yeah, so we are 250 years back in time or so. It would have been very remarkable to find something like that early on and be accurate even today. Yeah. I think it's open games. Many different people have many different opinions. Sardis, for instance, could be the city of Sardis. From what I know, Sophia was called Sardis also in ancient times or so. So these names existed in different places.
Yeah, so we cannot really be sure about what the equivalents could be in today's terms.
Not for now.
Thank you. And another of our viewers, Ur Kilarji, asked a question. In Afyo Beyköy Mosque, there are some scripts from ancient time, probably the recycled materials in the construction of the mosque, which mention about the Luwian invasion. So, what do we know about them?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm the one who triggered this discussion. This is in the very inscription from Mellard's office that I showed, that I found in his study. He says it was found it came from Afyon. It was found there in 1883 or so. But this whole story is definitely entirely made up. From what we know now about Mellard, he just made up the story. So Berthausen thinks that the inscription is genuine. It's a copy of an inscription that really exists, because it would have been impossible for somebody to invent such a detailed and grammatically highly accurate inscription. But the story about how it was found is definitely made up. There's no doubt about it. It has nothing to do with the mosque in Beyköy. Beyköy is an interesting place, but not because of that.
Oh, thank you. And also, we had another question about from Asli Umar, who asked us when you said forger about James Mellard, was that in a positive or negative manner? But we got the answer right now.
Yes. Do you
So,
want me to comment on this? No.
Yeah. So now we've got another question here, and this asks: is the Luwian language deciphered? So can we translate it into the modern languages?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Yes,
No problem. Yeah.
we have mentioned that already.
There are so few Luwian inscriptions that everybody is anxious to have them and publish them, and so what we know is published and translated. Yes.
Yes. So another of our viewers, Olcay Junlu, asked a question for us. So he says, which people were called the last Luwian origin? In some studies, it is said that the Isaura people were the last people of Luwian origin and largely disappeared in the 6th century BC. Do you agree?
Well, it depends, and I use Luwian as an abstract term. I do not use it as an ethnic term. If you apply it to the language, then there are people with Luwian names, even in the Roman times. Howington Cate worked on that. That's basically it. It's not an ethnic term. It's a language and a script, and now it's an abstract term on top of that.
Yes, he already sent us his apologies if he missed that part, in case you told it. But in the beginning of this of our talk, you have already mentioned that you're using the Luwian term as an umbrella term for the people who speak a certain language, who represent a certain culture in the late Bronze Age in the Western Anatolia. We know that actually we're not talking about a certain political structure, or we're not talking about a certain ethnicity, but it's just an umbrella term for the people who lived in the Western Turkey. And I'm trying to check for other questions now. I guess I'm not getting any new questions at the moment.
We make some up. Do you have any, Gökhan?
Well, actually, I had prepared lots of questions before the broadcast, but as you know, before our meeting, I had already passed those questions to you, which made up the structure of this interview. And most of my questions have been answered by your presentation, so thank you very much for that. And This has been very informative because, as I told you, the Luwians do not appear in the textbooks, and most of the people would be very curious about why they wouldn't. But the Eurocentric point of view, as you told, uh, just excluded them because of the borders they made up at the Aegean. And it's interesting because those borders are also the modern political borders between Turkey and Greece, so which can be culturally European and the Anatolian cultures. I would like to check out. We have got two more questions coming from our viewers, and here I'd like to choose this one. So Aslı Umar asked another question. She says, I wonder if cuneiform is more developed kind of a script than hieroglyphs, or are they like different types of scripture?
Very different types of scriptures. I wouldn't compare them in terms of development. I think the higher echelons were probably writing cuneiform, and Luwian, because it was so graphic, was something that ordinary people could probably also understand, the Luwian script or so. And maybe that's one reason why it lasted longer, because it was easier to use, and basically, yeah.
So another of our viewers, Mejit Vergül, asked us, according to this presentation, what do we need for the Louis' wide acceptance?
Thank you very much. What we don't have is a center, a city center. Yeah, so in Greece we have Mycenae and Tiryns and Pylos and all those nice palaces, and there are many more. Arsine, Medea, Iolkos, and so on, and they've all been excavated and they're visible, so tangible. We don't have that with the Luwians. We do not have a cosmopolitan center, and in particular, we do not have a library. We do not have documents. So that would be nice to find a place like that, where we have the seat of a king, for sure, and also his archive.
And another of our viewers from Cappadocia University, Miss Sedan Edgu, she asks, is there a possibility that the Luwian hieroglyphs could be older than the 3rd millennia BC?
No. I'm not a linguist, but because the system is not the science, but the grammatical system is derived from cuneiform or so, the sequence is pretty well known. So, but if you ask experts on Luwian hieroglyphic, they entirely disagree when it was introduced. Fred Wauthausen would put it probably around 2000 BC, when you see the first individual signs. And many others would put it much later, 15th or even 14th century BC, when you have the first complete sentences. But you have that kind of discussion in other parts of the world. You have it in China as well or so. It's very difficult to say when the script was really used systematically if you only have individual signs.
Yeah.
But Fred Wauthausen has described one inscription from Beche Sultan, which actually is the word Mira on a seal, and he takes this as the first evidence for the use of the script, and that is around 2000 BC.
Yeah. So she also added another comment saying that she asked this question because some of the forms, probably depictions in Göbekli Tepe in Şanlıurfa, Turkey, looks similar to the Luwian forms, and the Hittites called it the language of the gods.
Yes.
So
The language of the gods? What did they call the language of the gods? Not Göbekli Tepe.
No, no. So this is her comment. Maybe she can
Okay,
bring up
I don't know about the
more
language of
details.
the gods. I haven't heard that. But Göbekli Tepe, yes, of course, I know the sign for deity, which is like a belt knuckle. It appears in Göbekli Tepe and is very prominent in the Luwian hieroglyphic or so. Göbekli Tepe is extremely important and extremely interesting, but it's also incredibly old. It's 10,000 years older than the Luwians. I would not be able to. I mean, 10,000 years, it's the time from today to the Trojan War times 3. Yeah, it's beyond our imagination. I would not make any connections there.
Yeah. So Olcay Junlu asked another question, and he says, in one article that he read, it is said that archaeologists had to give a common name to the people of Scythia, Caria, Lycia, and Cilicia. It is Luwi. I know that you have already answered this question in the very beginning of our interview, but so maybe you could answer this question once again.
Yeah, if it depends on what time we are talking about. If we are talking about the late Bronze Age, I would think it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, because we have the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans, of course, would never have called themselves Mycenaeans. That's laughable. Yeah, and they would not have identified themselves with let's say an ethnicity or so, because they were competing. They were fighting each other. Yeah, there were 30 or so different kings, and they were killing each other. Yeah, and then they formed one. Apparently, to the legend, according to the legend, they formed one military alliance to go into the Trojan War. But before that, there was no unity, and this is what ancient Greek authors talk about. It's not something that I make up. They clearly say there was no unity before the Trojan War.
Yeah. So there's one more question. This one is a long one, so it will be very difficult to include on the screen, but I will read this one. Dr. Alper Gölbaş, who's an archaeologist, he asks this. After the attack of the Sea People in the 1200s, Ramses III in inscriptions states that the foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands, and all at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their armies from Hatti, Kizzuwatna, Karkamish, Arzawa, and Alashia. This is the text you have coded in your presentation. And he brings this question. In what order were the names of these cities counted? In the order of importance or in the order of occupation? Or is it by chance or by coincidence?
I think it is basically a random order. It's
random.
Yeah. I think there's no meaning to that. The scribes didn't really take their job very serious when it comes to historic accuracy or geographic accuracy.
Mm-hmm. And another viewer, Sinan, asks us. Actually, this is a statement. From what I understand, the Trojans are or were related to the Luwians.
Yes, well, you know that there was one, but the only piece of evidence for writing that was ever found in Troy is a sealed stone that has Luwian inscription on it. It's from the 11th century, I think. But that's not enough evidence. Most people think that there were different people at Troy at any given time, but then also from time over time. Yeah, so it was a mixture of languages, a mixture of ethnicities, different people in charge at different times. So Troy, because of its position on the border or so, may have been controlled by different people at different times. I personally would call them Luwians because from all we know, Troy had a leading role in the Sea People attacks. The Tekkers, those with the feather crowns, they were Trojans, apparently, and they're very prominent in the Sea People inscriptions and also in the pictures and all the accounts. Basically, this letter from the Cypriot admiral actually mentions a Trojan leader who is in charge of the fleet that is attacking the Eastern Mediterranean. And the text that the Bakoi 2 text from Mellard's office says the same thing. In that case, actually 4 different princes from Troy were in charge of the fleet or so. So everything goes back to Troy. And that's why in terms of the umbrella term, I would consider Troy to be Luwian. That doesn't mean that people spoke Luwian there or that they used Luwian script. It's just not Mycenaean and not Hittite. And that's why it's Luwian for me.
Yes, namely Luwian, if we have to give them a name. And there is one more question, but before showing up this question, I also would like to refer to one of your works, because this question is about Troy, Luwians, and Atlantis. And I know that since early 1990s, you have been interpreting the Plato's Atlantis as if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but as the corrupt version of the Egyptians' side of this story. So, what do you have to say about this? So, the connection between Troy, Luwians, and the Atlantis.
Well, you may have noticed that I used the Plato quote in the talk because it is so much. The parallels are so obvious between those 2 attacks, and what I did at the time in the early 90s, I then applied Plato's description of the physical city to Troy and found so many parallels. But there is no point in continuing this discussion as long as the alluvial plain below the citadel of Troy is not investigated, because that is where the city would have been. I mean, it's obvious that the citadel is not a city. Yeah. So who was producing the food that the kings were eating? So there must have been ordinary people, and we don't know where they lived. And the obvious place for them to be would be the plain of Troy, where the actual city is buried under 6 meters of sediments. And as long as nobody is paying attention to that, there's no point in having this discussion.
Yeah. And so this one is also a curious one. Is there any initiative from Turkey that gives support to your studies about Luwians?
Well, I have friends, and there's a spectrum. There are people who really like what we are doing and give me pictures and support the whole idea and invite me for lectures or so. Then there are people who are quite opposed to what we are doing. Of course, this is always the same in science. As far as governmental official connections are concerned, no, they do not exist.
Also, I would like to extend this topic because I know that you wanted to do some ground-penetrating radar research in Troy, and you wanted to get the permissions for that, but that didn't end up very well.
No, this was I think 1998 or so, where we suggested to use helicopter geophysics. Today, you could probably do it with a drone. And so we would not touch the ground. You would just fly over the alluvial plain with ground-penetrating electromagnetic devices penetrating the ground, and then we would get a 3-dimensional picture of what's under the surface. This has never been done anywhere. I think even today it hasn't really been done on that scale. So that was quite a pioneering task, but we did not get the permission to do that. And one wonders why, because Turkey, from all the work that I've done in the past 30 years, it's only beneficial for Turkey. It has always been putting Turkish Anatolian cultures in the best possible light, pointing out how much there is to be discovered. And here we would have a project that would attend media interest. At the time, there were 30 different television production firms who wanted to report about this, and it would be completely harmless information. Now it's standard technique, of course, on all archaeological excavations to use natural scientific remote sensing devices before you start with the excavations. But Troy was, of course, begun 150 years ago when these standards didn't exist and the methods didn't exist. So it would be time now to do it.
Yeah. So this is one of the questions actually, which has its answers within your presentation, but probably this viewer joined us later on. How many Luwian scripts or tablets, documents were found?
Oh, now you caught me. A couple of hundred, something like that. But most of them, it's like 200 or so. And I don't know the exact number, but most of them are from Iron Age Syria. So we have relatively little from late Bronze Age and virtually nothing from Western Anatolia. So
yes. So we are getting a few more questions. So this one, this is, I believe, from one of our fellow tour guides, Errol Sauda. He asks, which are the sites that have the most amount of Luwian scripts from?
I would say Hattusha.
Hattusha.
Yes, well, in terms of Bronze Age, and then after that, probably Carchemish and in the early Iron Age.
And this is an interesting one. I would like to include this question, although the answer is obvious, but I've heard some comments or interpretations about this one, just based on the phonetical way the names sound. But here, this question says, have there been any questions or comments on Luwians and Alawites in Turkey lately? Or do you ever come across with these comments?
Yes, there was a time when people thought that the Alawites can be associated with the Luwians. I do not believe in these ethnic attributions at all. I mean, and I asked Fred Wouthausen at the time about it. He said it doesn't make any sense to him.
Actually, I 100% agree with you on this, but I'm really curious about this because the people just look at names and they set a how can I say, a connection between two entirely irrelevant names just based on how the names sound. But do you have any idea why the people do these kind of comments, and what are they trying to get to?
Well, it's all about identity. That's something that has been really reinforced. Eurocentricity is something, and actually has worked out. Yeah, it has united Europe, even though it was politically completely fragmented. And it's a political instrument. You can use nationalism or ethnicity to unite people, and it doesn't cost you anything. You know? But for me personally, it's completely irrelevant. If you can remember two generations, your father, your grandfather, but beyond that, everything is basically made up.
Yes. So I will check once again, but I think that's all we have. Eberhard, I would like to thank you so much for joining us, sharing your valuable time and valuable knowledge with us. And this has been completely precious interview for us. So thank you once again.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. Good night.
So good night, everybody. I think this was all, and we hope to see you in our upcoming interviews. So thank you for joining us. Goodbye. Good night.
Bye-bye.